Good evening, Inya Ali Madet. Welcome to our SWB Social Welfare Board Parent Support Group event on understanding and supporting dyslexia and dyspraxia. I'm delighted to welcome Lindsay Uzzell this evening. She is an experienced learning support teacher with a bachelor from the University of Victoria. She's worked globally, Vancouver, Japan, and London, in both the state and private schools. She is Orton Gillingham trained. For those of you who know that, it's a structured literacy approach that was designed to help struggling readers. And many reading programs today actually use this method. Her personal experience, and that's what makes her contribution this evening so unique, she also has a son with dyspraxia, and who was identified when he was 4 years old, and he also has dyscalculia. That was also identified a little bit later when he was 9, and he now attends a specialist school in London for dyspraxia and dyslexia. So that's all I'm going to say about her. Just a little bit of housekeeping before she takes over. We are recording tonight's session for those people who have unable to attend but then can access it later. We would just ask that we keep you muted while Lindsay is going to speak. She's going to talk for about sort of 20-25 minutes. If you have questions while she's talking, pop them in the chat box, because we will look at that at the end. And then we have left the rest of the session available for your question and answers. So there is ample time to do that. Without further ado, I will hand you over to Lindsay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, and good evening, everybody. And thanks so much for having me do this, Shaheen, as well, and talk to you all. So our agenda for this evening, I'm going to talk about what dyslexia and dyspraxia is and give you a definition. And I'll talk quite a lot about the key features in identifying dyslexia and dyspraxic children, the effects on children that these learning difficulties have, how they can be assessed and diagnosed, and as well different approaches as to how you can support your dyslexic and dyspraxic children at home as well. And then, as Shaheen said at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So next slide, please, Manu. Great. So I thought we'd start with a definition of neurodiversity, and I'll read this for you and then I'll break it down a little bit. So neurodiversity is a term used to describe neurological differences in the human brain. From this perspective, the diverse spectrum of neurological difference is viewed as a range of natural variations in the human brain rather than as a deficit in individuals. So basically, the neuro part of neurodiversity refers to the brain, and the diversity part are the differences. And the diverse spectrum refers to the different learning difficulties that are included in being neurodiverse. And often students or children are referred to as neurodiverse or neurodivergent. And this spectrum includes difficulties such as ASD, which is autism, ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also ADD, which is attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity, dyslexia and dyspraxia, which we'll talk about tonight, dysgraphia, which is a learning difficulty connected to writing, dyscalculia, which is a learning difficulty connected to math, Tourette syndrome, and OCD as well. So let's start with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a common learning difficulty, and it mainly causes difficulties with reading, writing, spelling, and processing information. And unlike a learning disability, which is also cognitive, intelligence with dyslexia is not affected. And actually, dyslexic children are very intelligent. It's just they have a specific difficulty with language. Dyspraxia, and it's also referred to as developmental coordination disorder, is a condition, and it's a learning difficulty as well, but it's a condition that affects motor planning and physical coordination. So basically what this means is your brain sends signals to the rest of your body, your gross motor and your fine motor system. But with a child that is dyspraxic, the messages or the signals don't get there fast enough. And so this affects the coordination and the execution of that message that the brain has sent. So the child isn't able to do it, or they do it more slowly, or they do it less effectively. Great. So just before I go into the key challenges and talk about that, this is a piece of writing that I thought you could take a look at, and just think, if you are dyslexic and you were approaching some reading, this is how you might see material to read. And so think about how it makes you feel, and also think about what challenges you have as you're attempting to decode this. So I'll just give you a few seconds to take a look at that, see if you can figure out what the words are and what that excerpt is trying to say. Just thinking about that piece of writing. If you are dyslexic, the biggest attribute is phonological awareness between symbols and sounds, and not being able to, or having difficulty recognizing those and connecting those. And so basically that comes in with decoding, because if you're dyslexic, you're unable to make these links between sounds and symbols. And so being able to identify and read words is not automatic. So you've got to really think about what the symbol is, for example, the letter A and the sound it makes, A, B, B. And you've got to be able to see that symbol, connect that sound, and then link those letters and those sounds into words to be able to read. And so that is difficult for somebody who's dyslexic. They might see the words, as you probably saw in that excerpt, as backwards. Also, different words can be transposed that are similar. So for example, the word was and the word saw, they have the same letters. So oftentimes dyslexic students will reverse them. And so letters might move around as well on a page. And so that makes it more challenging as well to be able to read. Another challenge is short-term and working memory. So working memory is basically when you are given some information that you need to hold temporarily in your brain, and then be able to access it to execute a task. So for example, perhaps you are trying to find an address, you've got the address in your head, then you've got the directions, the steps of how to get there. So you've got to hold that in your memory to be able to use the information that you've been told to get there. So for somebody who is dyslexic, their working memory is weak, and they have difficulty filtering out what information is required, what needs to be done first, how things should be sequenced. So that is a challenge for them, and it makes it hard for them to remember things, and that affects their short-term memory as well. So if given information, a typical child would be able to remember 5 to 9 pieces of information, but a child who's dyslexic would only be able to remember around 3 pieces of information. And unfortunately, if information doesn't make it into the short-term memory, then you're not able to remember it long-term either. So it might appear that somebody with dyslexia has forgotten something on purpose, but actually, if it wasn't in their short-term memory to begin with, it would be like it never actually really ever even existed for them. So this also ties into slow processing speed. And again, due to working memory, there isn't a very straightforward or linear route to store information, but also retrieve information. So it takes a much longer time. And again, with that excerpt that you were trying to decode yourself, you had to, look at the word, it was backwards in your heads, and then you had to reverse the words around. So that's processing. So that took more time for you because you had to also access the information, again, the symbols, the sounds, putting it all together. And so again, it slows everything down. Decoding and encoding words is what we've just talked about. Decoding is being able to read the words and decode them and connect those letters to the sounds and put them in order and figure out what the words are. And encoding is the reverse, it's spelling. So it's, again, thinking about what's the sound, what symbol does that represent? Then I've got to write it down on the page, and then I've got to put all those symbols in order to make a word. So again, those are things that are challenges. And then again, with processing and having to decode and encode, again, when you were reading through that excerpt, it would have taken you a long time. And because you were spending so much time trying to decode, the comprehension is then lost because you're focused so much on trying to even figure out what the words are. And that's the same with expression as well. So dyslexic children will often skip over the punctuation, or they might read the sentences together, or they might not even notice it because they're just trying to figure out what the words say. And lack of automaticity is, again, just being able to do something quickly so your brain can be open for higher order thinking. But if you're constantly having to figure out words, it's not automatic for you. It's going to be more tiring, and it's more stressful too on the brain. And then low self-confidence. So basically, dyslexic children will focus more on their weaknesses. They'll think more about what they can't do, and they'll probably see children at school that, you know, are reading at a higher level or are able to write more. And so rather than focusing on their strengths, they tend to focus on their weaknesses. And so that creates, of course, low self-confidence. So moving on to dyspraxia, and as Shaheen said, my son is dyspraxic, so I have more of a connection with this difficulty personally. So the challenges with dyspraxia, one of the big ones is gross and fine motor movements. So gross motor movements are sort of whole body movements, and an individual can appear more clumsy and uncoordinated. And again, it's because the messages aren't getting through, they're getting lost or blocked, and then the required result is not being produced for whatever that task might be, such as throwing and catching a ball would be a gross motor movement. Difficulties with fine motor movements. So these are anything to do with your hands, your fingers, things like handwriting, but also manipulating a knife and fork, for example. And it also can affect your left and right. So individuals with dyspraxia do not have both brain hemispheres responding in a coordinated fashion. So sometimes this can also affect hand preference. And a dyspraxic child, especially as a younger child, will go between their left and right. They won't have a preference early on. Balance and core stability is another challenge because muscle tone is quite poor with dyspraxic children. And they often suffer from muscle fatigue actually and get tired more easily. And this was one thing actually when my son was young, you know, he would often have to go into the stroller more frequently than other children, or he couldn't seem to walk as far. And that was because he just didn't have that core stability and that strength. Or, you know, sometimes when he'd be on the sofa, he'd sort of be slumped over. He just couldn't keep himself positioned upright as easily. And that was quite tiring for him. Heightened sensitivity to taste, touch, textures, noise, light, and smells. So this can, of course, lead to sensory overload, and any heightened sensitivity to things can also then distract children with dyspraxia. So their concentration, they have concentration problems because they can't filter out that external stimuli. They're, you know, distracted by the bright lights, or maybe there's a strange smell in the room that, and again, they can probably smell it, but maybe another person couldn't. So it's things like that. And that was another thing when my son was quite young, he, even from birth, actually, he was very sensory, and he hated loud noise, and he would get really upset if we were in crowds and it was noisy. And so that was something right away that I sort of noticed from a very young age. And also to clothing and things being too tight or too loose as well from a very young age. Those were things with him, but it can be, you know, various sensitivities to other things as well. Speech and language can also be affected because the coordination of the muscles also affect the mouth. And so another common trait is messy eating. So again, my son still struggles with that sometimes, and he actually isn't always aware that he has food on his face, and I need to remind him to wipe it off the napkin, things like that. And again, that's more sensory too. Exaggerated emotional response. So again, this is like overreacting to things. And again, it's a result sometimes of that sensory overload and having a meltdown or a tantrum. So not always the sort of expected response, I guess you could say, to a situation. So this is various things. It can be where the child is in their own physical space. So, you know, they might not have that awareness of personal space or being up too close to someone. My son frequently steps on my feet, for example. He's not really always aware sort of where I am in proximity to him. But it can also be things like orientation between knowing your left and right, distance, such as crossing a road. It's also sequencing instructions and personal organization. So that's something that if you are dyspraxic, you really struggle with, is just keeping on top of organizing yourself. And lastly, the social relationships as well can be affected. And often children with dyspraxia aren't as tuned into nonverbal cues from peers, and it can make social relationships, again, a little bit more challenging, similar to ASD in that respect. So the other things that are similar to dyslexia, actually, and there are commonalities between the learning difficulties. With every learning difficulty, there are core attributes. So dyslexia, it's phonological processing; dyspraxia, it's motor coordination; ADHD, it's impulsivity. But then they all actually overlap as well. And so the commonalities with dyslexia and dyspraxia are short-term and working memory, which I talked about before, anxiety and low self-confidence, as well as the processing speed. So processing as well is another commonality. And it is quite common, actually. It's called co-occurrence or comorbidity, that that learning difficulties will occur at the same time or both be present. So it is very common that dyslexia and dyspraxia occur together, and that's sort of a 45 to 50% rate. My son goes to a school for dyslexic and dyspraxic students, and so it is quite common that students have both there, or they might have difficulties in math as well, because 50 to 60% of dyslexic children also struggle with math, because again, there's the numbers and reversing numbers and the symbols that they have to learn in the language for math as well. And ADHD and dyslexia co-occur 63% of the time too. So that's just sort of an interesting thing to be aware of, that often you might have one learning difficulty, but you might also have another one. So they will overlap and there will be similarities between them. Right, so I thought I would just touch on a few more specific examples of how children can be affected by dyspraxia and dyslexia. So physical children can be affected physically, mostly with dyspraxia, and you will notice this in PE, or if your children are involved in sports activities, because the gross motor skills are required, and this can be a struggle. So things like throwing and catching a ball are trickier. Being less coordinated means that people with dyspraxia too are more accident prone in sports, or if they're running around or doing things outside, they might bump into things or get injured more easily. Due to the poor sense of balance, we talked about the core stability, things like riding a bike can be difficult. And then any fine motor skills, such as doing up buttons on a shirt or tying shoelaces, can create a challenge as well. And then daily activities like using a knife and fork to eat or cutting paper with scissors. So these are all physical skills that can be more challenging if you are dyspraxic. Psychological, again, we touched on the self-esteem and the anxiety as well. And part of that with dyspraxia and dyslexia is, you know, if it's better if a child is identified, that they know about their learning difficulty, because it is actually one of the facts when I was taking a course through the British Dyslexia Association. They did talk about that, how juveniles or students who are undiagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia, they often find themselves in trouble with the law or making poor choices in life, and sort of not being aware that they have this difficulty can psychologically affect their minds, and then that can affect their choices as well, and how they negatively might perceive themselves and their capabilities. So I just wanted to mention that too. Educationally, one thing, and I remember this happened at my son's school actually when he was 4 in reception, but the teacher used to keep him in to finish his work at playtime and he didn't get to go to play. And I was really upset about that. And she said, oh, well, he just isn't very focused on his work and he doesn't get it done in time, and sort of almost referring to him as being lazy. And so that's one thing, sometimes because of the slower processing speed, teachers may think that a child is slow intellectually or being lazy, but it's just in fact they need more time to process the information, and that they are able to do the work, but they just need to be given a little bit of extra time, and that sort of punishing them for not being able to finish their work isn't the best way forward. Socially, we talked about this before a little bit, but especially with dyspraxic children, you'll find that they might prefer to sometimes be alone, or they might struggle to make friends. And that this kind of overlaps a bit with ASD and autism. So another thing is just really liking that structure as well, and liking to know what's happening. And again, being in crowds can be overwhelming due to sensitivities and things like that. So just to be mindful of that. And the last one was emotionally. And I think this, again, was just more, I was going to talk about routines. And especially with dyspraxic children, they don't like to have unexpected changes, which again sort of is similar to autism and ASD. And so it's just good to have that structure in place in the routines and sort of forewarn them whenever possible. So that was just a little bit more detail on how children can be affected. Now that we've talked a bit about the challenges and the effects on children, we have 2 videos for you to watch. The first one is a parent with a son who is dyspraxic, and she's talking about his challenges. And the second video that we'll watch after is children who are dyslexic, and they're talking about their challenges and how dyslexia has affected them.
Was always slightly different to all the other children that we knew. He fell over all the time. He was very poor balance. He would fall out of high chairs. He'd fall off a seat, trip up over nothing. All the other children were holding pens. They were scribbling already. They were talking. James wasn't talking. My view of dyspraxia is that it's a disorder of motor planning and execution. So he knows what he wants to achieve, but his ability to show you that he's achieved it is difficult. So he has an intelligence up here, and his physical ability may be down here, and this gap is what I call his frustration gap. So he knows what he wants to get to, but getting there is just beyond his grasp. Well, there are a lot of things that we've done sort of functionally that assist the dyspraxia, so like the writing slope that he can use. We also have pencil grips that he can choose different types of pencil grips or thickness of pens. Then there are other things, that we do. He's got a swing seat, so if he needs calming down, he'll go and sit in his swing and have a little calm down. James is always basically in a state of flight because he's stressed about everything and everything's very difficult, so it's challenging. So we just have to try and regulate him. So if he's running low, he might want to go and do something like jumping on his trampoline or something to get him going. And just the bouncing, the act of bouncing is giving him a lot of feedback of where his body is from gravity and from the tension in the bed of the trampoline. And he absolutely loves that. Dyspraxia is the classic hidden handicap because it is a handicap. It affects every area of his life. And people who just look at a snapshot view of James will say, "Puh, what's the matter with him?" People just fail to accept that there is an issue with him, and that really does frustrate you because, how can he deliver what his potential is if people aren't assisting him and understanding him? Was always slightly...
When I was younger, I was reading way below grade level, and it was really hard. I'm really good at comprehending what the story is trying to say, but actually reading through all of the words was really hard. So I got over that, and now I'm reading above grade level, but still.
Homework is an experience. It usually takes me 5 or 6 hours to do not all of my homework. I can get 3 assignments done maybe, and it hurts my mind, and sometimes if I have lots to do, I even wake up early and do more homework.
We would have these coded books on which color you were, and of course, me being a dyslexic, I was in the lowest color. You kind of feel alone at the very beginning. Dyslexia is a learning disability type thing, and it affects me in reading. But I also have dysgraphia, which affects me in spelling and writing. One thing that I have trouble with is I can't read my writing. So when my teacher asks me to read out loud my writing, I can't because I can't read my writing.
Is that you're not average. That could mean many things. It's like you might be worse in some areas, like I was worse in reading and writing, but you might excel in other things like math for me, science. I enjoy those greatly.
It's not a huge difference. I'd say definitely don't let it get in your way and think that it's a downside or a negative. It's just a different way of learning, and you might just need to do some different stuff or whatever works for you.
So I think those videos too as well lead nicely into the next part, which is talking about strengths and then also looking at some strategies with which the parent in the one video, but also some of the children talked as well about different things that help them as well. So we'll move into that. So as well as the many challenges, there are strengths to being dyslexic and dyspraxic. One strength is having a strong visual spatial awareness. That's where objects are in space. So this might even be something like mapping skills or planning of architecture, building, that type of thing. They're also excellent problem solvers and have big picture thinking skills. So instead of looking at little parts of something, they'll look at the whole picture and figure out ways to solve a problem. Another strength is being a good verbal communicator. This is especially true for dyslexics. They often speak very well. They have exceptional vocabularies. But it's just when they go to then put that into writing that becomes difficult. But verbally, they're very strong. Creative, so artistically as well. And you do actually see a lot of dyslexics in professions such as acting or the film industry or architecture, design. And it's interesting because even a lot of the parents at my son's school, they also have these difficulties, which they've passed onto their kids. And they're all in these different fields, which I found really interesting. Not your typical fields like teacher, doctor, lawyer, but more creative fields, and all very successful. Determination, and motivation and resilience. So again, just from having to struggle and having to find new ways of figuring out how to do things, that does create a determination to succeed and to prove yourself, and also resilience, because you have to be resilient. It's going to be difficult for you and for them, and they're just going to have to get through it and figure out the best way forward. Enthusiasm and passion for personal interests. Again, especially even with dyspraxic children, a bit similar again to autism, but they'll focus in on something that they're really passionate about and usually become quite enthusiastic about that topic or that certain sport or something that motivates them. Good long-term memory as well. So again, weaker short-term and working memory, but remembering things that happened years ago or little details that might have happened a long time ago, they have a surprisingly good memory for. sensitive and empathetic to others and relating well to children. This is more specific to dyspraxic children. And it could be, again, to do with the connection they have to being sensory. But it seems to be a statistic that they do relate better to children who are actually older and younger than them as well. Assessment and diagnosis. So for dyslexia, a screening would usually be done by the SENCO at your school. So usually the teacher, if there are concerns, the teacher will have spoken to you, or you might have spoken to the teacher, and then they'll put in a referral to be screened by the SENCO. And a formal diagnosis requires a specialist teacher or an educational psychologist. So often, like Shaheen at our school, she'll do her own assessment for dyslexia, but then if she feels that there is possibly dyslexia, then she'll refer further on to an educational psychologist for a more thorough report and assessment. And the big thing, though, with any of these difficulties is if you do suspect something, early intervention is the best. And often formal diagnosis for dyslexia isn't until about the age of 7. However, I think, Shaheen, you said that sometimes they will diagnose earlier than that as well. But if you do think that your child could be dyslexic, it is worth having the assessment, because then strategies also can be put in place more quickly at school, such as reading recovery programs or reading support. Dyspraxia is a little bit different. It's a little bit harder actually to diagnose because it isn't done through an ed psych. So again, oftentimes, if your child is at a young age, like my son was having, a lot of difficulties with the sensory. And so we started taking him to occupational therapy, and it was the occupational therapist who then said, he's possibly dyspraxic, you might want to have him assessed. So then we took him to CAMS, which is in my borough, Camden, Child and Mental Health Services. And so basically the health professional there assessed him, and she was the one that said, yes, I think he is dyspraxic. And then we were able to get a contact from the OT, who then sent us on to a pediatrician who specialized in dyspraxia, and he was able to give the diagnosis. So it's more through a pediatrician or specialized health practitioner that you would get the diagnosis for that. These are strategies that actually are useful for both children who are dyslexic and dyspraxic. So one thing, as we talked about with the working memory, because it's poor, it's really important that if you are giving instructions to your child, to really break them down and just give 1 or 2 at a time. So for years, my son gets the same instructions every evening. Do your teeth, put your clothes in the laundry, get on your pajamas, use the toilet, and always, still, even now, one of those things isn't done. So, if I were to just give him the short, simple instructions, then he can go do it. So 1 or 2 at a time, he's able to do. But even now, he struggles with, 4 or 5 things in one go. Opportunities to pre-learn and overlearn. So again, it's really important with dyslexic and dyspraxic children that they have a lot of repetition. And this would be with things that they're learning at school. But again, also skills if they're a part of a sports team or, something, an extracurricular activity that they're doing, they might just need a bit more time and a bit more practice. Keeping activities brief and short as well, especially for dyspraxic children who might get tired more easily. Allowing extra time for homework and activities. And so, just giving that extra time, just letting them, not rushing them through things if it is taking a while, but also I think having that balance and knowing when to, okay, now we've done enough, like this is enough for you, let's stop, because it can get frustrating as well. So I think it's important to not to get to that point where the child is extremely frustrated. And communicate that to the teacher as well. Awareness that the school day is more tiring. So again, it's more tiring because their brain is having to actually think harder to figure things out. It's more tiring physically, especially for the dyspraxic child. So when they get home, they probably are going to be more tired. So, less extracurricular, to be honest, is better. Not pushing them too much. And you probably will expect more meltdowns and that too, because they're holding it all together at school, and then they're getting home and they're kind of releasing it all to you. And giving them rest breaks as well. This is important at school too, but also at home. So go with the flow with your child and what they're capable of. Be consistent with establishing routines. Especially important for that personal organization. And also with the personal organization part, visual timetables help, reminders, wall planners if you have something in your house so that they can see their schedule and what's happening. Allow extra time to process information and answer questions. And we talked about this with homework as well. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to have a lozenge here because my voice is getting a bit. I had a cold last weekend. Multisensory tasks or visual support, and Shaheen and I were actually, I had meant to bring some of these to show you, but if you would like to see some examples, we're happy to take some photos at school and send them to you. But these are things like high frequency word cards or letter lines, number lines, times tables chart. We have some reading rulers which have the colored overlays on them. I forgot to talk about that with the dyslexia. But sometimes having a different color over the white paper and the black writing actually can help visually for dyslexic children to read as well. Also when reading and spelling, just to avoid correcting every error. So if, let's say, they substitute the word a for the, just leave it, let it go, unless it affects the meaning of what they're reading, because you don't want to be correcting them on everything because they will make more frequent mistakes. For writing tasks at home, using word webs or brainstorming ideas or talking about ideas first is really helpful. And another strategy, of course, is to focus on what they're good at and just keep reminding them of their strengths, because they will tend to focus on their difficulties. So we've talked a bit about the visual aids. So those would be things like your letter lines, your word cards. Use of IT. So that's another thing. There are different technology tips that can help dyslexic students, such as you can set the computer so that it actually reads aloud to you, or you can speak into the computer to record your voice and then it comes out as writing. And again, we do have information on this. So if you would like more information about how to assist technology for your child, we can provide this too. Audiobooks, so again, listening to books rather than reading all the time. And if you are doing reading, it's no problem to share the reading with your child. I used to do that a lot with my son. He'd read a page, I'd read a page. And even now, I still read out loud to him a lot from chapter books, because of course, he, isn't able to always read the books that he would like to be able to read, but I can read them to him and he can still listen to them and enjoy them. And again, having some of those aids that you saw that one mom had for her son with the pencil grips or the sloping desk as well. So there are different tools that you can use to help. And again, overlearning new skills. So it's more automatic, so the brain can be free for higher order thinking. And those would be things like tables or spellings. So strategies to support dyspraxia. Some of these you actually saw in the video. So she had that swinging chair. Not everyone can have that in their house, I understand. But even things like beanbag chairs, my son used to love going on a big exercise ball, and he'd go over the exercise ball into the beanbag chair, and that would give him the input he needed to regulate as well. Rebounders, big trampolines or small trampolines also are great, as she had used. Also, adaptations. So if shoelaces are too hard, there's so many shoes now with Velcro straps, right up to older kids. Less buttons, or you can help do up the buttons so they only have the top two to do themselves. So little adaptations like that can really help. And then of course, lots of opportunities for climbing, ball skills, motor skills. You want to encourage that so they can build up their strength. And even things like wall sits or push-ups against a wall or crab walks or any of those types of things are really good for that vestibular and the core stability. And just again, really being aware of your child and their needs. So a lot of dyspraxic children will be anxious in a new situation. They're not always comfortable with new people that they don't know. So just being aware of that and preempting it, and talking to them about a new situation before you go, or if there is a change coming up, giving a 5-minute warning so that they know that this change is going to happen. So just doing little things like that can really help your child and make it easier for them too. Great. So this is a resource, a link here with the British Dyslexia Association. And actually a lot of my information too came from a course I did through them. So they're an excellent organization. They have a lot of resources on their website and more that you can read about dyslexia in particular. And this is another book here as well, I believe, Shaheen, you added to it.
When we just talked about earlier how it's important in terms of preserving a child's self-esteem. And so I think it's really important that they understand the nature of their learning difficulties. So using books like this one, Dyslexia is My Superpower, is a really good and useful one. Sorry, Lindsay, thank you for going through that, even though you are absolutely struggling.
Shaheen, you might be able to take this one, which has come through. So how is writing affected? And is it essential that the child writes? Why does the education system insist on writing? Not sure if you'll be able to answer that big question, but
Sure.
How is the writing affected? Yeah.
So I think the first thing about dyslexia is that it just doesn't affect two children in one way. So for some children, it's their reading that they find challenging. For some children, it is the writing process. And if you think of what is involved in the writing process, it's a lot of cognitive load. We are asking children to have good ideas. We are asking them to, formulate sentences in a structured manner, to think of good vocabulary, to use punctuation, to use spelling. So when we know that a lot of children with dyslexia have poor working memory, that is a lot, the whole writing process is very stressful, because that is a lot of things that you've got to put in place. So I think, yes, there is a lot of focus on writing. There is too much focus definitely on handwriting. And I think the reality is that, we live in a world of technology. So really, if your child is going to be diagnosed with dyslexia, there's actually no better time to have that diagnosis, because there is the assistive technology out there to help. So yes, you have to teach the handwriting, you have to teach the letter formation, but, we definitely advise at our school by the age of, sort of 7.5, 8, you want to get them touch typing, because as soon as their typing speed is up to what their writing speed would be like, you are taking away a lot of that stress, because if they're typing, you've got automatic spell check. They can go back and easily delete. It doesn't look messy because of the crossing out. So from a self-esteem perspective, the writing becomes easier if you are typing it, because they're not seeing, often children with dyslexia, when they're trying to write, they make several attempts at a word, and they're crossing out and they're trying it again, and then they're having another go. So that is one thing to look out for. They will do reversals, and which many schools will say, oh, that's normal. But if they're still actually reversing letters and numbers after the age of sort of, 7, 7.5, 8, that they should have established that by then. So that is, again, it's one of the things to look out for. I mean, you need a whole picture, obviously, to be able to put a diagnosis together. But obviously, so spelling, messy handwriting, and finding that whole, the challenge with the whole writing process. You can see children with dyslexia, dysgraphia, which dysgraphia is more of a sort of affects, like, they have problems sequencing information, and that whole challenges with the whole writing process. Like, you can see it's actually very laborious, that writing process for children with these all of these dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. They all come to what we call SPLD, specific learning difficulties. So it doesn't mean we're obviously focusing on dyslexia and dyspraxia today, but it could be that it's dysgraphia that they have, or it could be if it's an issue with mathematics, then it would be diagnosed as dyscalculia. So, but they all come under the same umbrella, and they all have similarities in that, there are challenges with the working memory, with the processing. But a lot of the strategies that we have covered today will work, for children with any SPLDs, basically. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Shaheen. I've got a couple more. So I've got a question here, which is asking, how do you manage their tiredness? So the child is really bright, but often too tired to do any more.
And absolutely, I mean, if you think of how exhausting a school day is for a child with any learning difficulty, because they are having to, conform and hold it together all day long. They're having to work a lot harder to concentrate in any given lesson. They're having to work a lot harder in social situations, because we saw the impact of not just in the academics, it does spill out. So then we do hear a lot of then they've been held it together all day long, and then they go home, and then it spills out, the frustration spills out. So I think the way to manage it is A, to be patient, and B, to be understanding and actually have that appreciation of actually they've done really well just to get through the school day. And yes, of course, there are demands, like, so depending on the school and how much homework, but then I guess it is about just learning what your child responds to. So for some, it might be they need to come home, they need to totally unwind and relax before you put any other further demands on them, because it becomes sort of counterproductive. You're trying to get them to read or learn spellings or learn tables or whatever it is, but they have been stressed out all day trying to just cope with the school day. So really just, I guess, taking it a bit easy and breaking things down into chunks, not expecting them to then come home and sit for a whole half an hour, 45 minutes, but actually, okay, well, we'll do 15 minutes of this, and then we'll do some playtime, and then we'll come back for 15 minutes for reading. So maybe breaking it down for the things that have to be done in an evening.
Yeah, and I was going to say that actually has worked really well for my son. So he'll get home, have a snack, have a break, have a play, then he'll come and do his homework after dinner, then he'll go back, have another play, then he'll finish his reading. So definitely breaking it up into chunks. But I think also communicating with your teacher too, maybe there is something that can be differentiated if it is too challenging, or maybe you don't complete something in total as well if you've worked on it for, let's say, 15 minutes. So just say, can we stop at that point? So sort of also communicating that with the teacher too, I think can help, so that they know as well that that's a frustration at home.
So I've got a couple of questions along the same theme here. So this is just going back to the previous question. So where we're talking about, writing and using technology like touch typing. But the question is, do you know if there are any plans for exam boards to allow for technology to be used in those exams?
Well, you see, again, that's where the diagnosis of dyslexia is really important, because when it comes to exams, if they have the diagnosis, then they are entitled to, exam accommodations. So one of the accommodations is extra time. And depending on when you've had your assessment by an educational psychologist, depending on what schools you have, normally it's just 25% extra time is pretty much the norm. So that actually is not so super helpful because it actually is not a long enough time. But there are other exam concessions as well that they are entitled to, and one of them is to use a word processor, because if that's what they need to be able to show their best work, then that's what we have to facilitate that. So definitely that's why a formal diagnosis is worth pursuing, because then those reasonable adjustments have to be made. Because if you are dyslexic, it does come under the 2010 Equality Act, and therefore reasonable adjustments do have to be made.
Hopefully that answered your questions, whoever asked those questions. I've got one more here. So if both parents have been diagnosed with mild dyslexia, is it likely to have been passed through the generations? And how do we pick it up? So this parent has got a child who's 4.5, so there's no diagnosis at the moment. But are there any ways for them to get some assessments, or do they need to wait until the child is a bit older, like 5 years old or something?
Yeah, I think I would probably wait. And there are early indicators as well. So often, children are less interested in books, or they're not as keen if you're doing alphabet puzzles or different things like that with them. They tend to avoid those types of things as well. That's kind of what I recognized with my own son, sort of that avoidance in doing different activities that maybe he didn't understand or couldn't think through. But if you are doing a little bit of, looking at letters and just kind of observe and see what you think that he is able to do or not able to do, because at that age, they should be able to pick out some of the symbols, maybe think of, some words that start with that sound. So, if your child's not able to do some of those basic things at that age, then that could be a bit of a precursor. And as well with writing, not interested in holding a pencil or drawing or doing those types of activities as well, kind of avoiding them. That is also another sort of very early indicator. And but yeah, I think it's better to hold off and wait. And there probably is a better chance that your child might be dyslexic if you both have dyslexia, I would say. I know with my son, his dad was dyslexic, possibly dyspraxic, but back then wasn't identified. So definitely runs in the family. And I know I have other, my uncle and my grandfather were both dyslexic, and my uncle's has 3 sons and 2 of them are dyslexic as well. So it definitely runs in families.
Absolutely, we are seeing that. I mean, I don't know what the research is out there exactly on that, but definitely in families. And of course, now we are better at identifying and picking things up early. Whereas, we will meet a lot of parents of children we are working with, and then they will say, "Oh yeah, I always couldn't spell properly," or I'd have trouble concentrating. So obviously, they never received a formal diagnosis, but it's likely that they had it. And so there is definitely a high prevalence if there is somebody in the family with some sort of learning difficulty. And yeah, I mean, again, we talked about this earlier, but early identification is important. And so it is about putting the right strategies in place early on, because if it is a phonics program that is multisensory, that is required, it's just so much more successful when you're doing it with a 5-year-old rather than wait till that is 7-year-old and they're already, far behind with the reading process.